Evolution is necessary for any franchise's long-term survival. Old series have to become new again without sacrificing their identity in the process. It's a difficult balancing act that Capcom and BioWare faced earlier this year with their respective games, Resident Evil 7 and Mass Effect Andromeda. Both promised an exciting beginning that was a fresh yet faithful interpretation of those that came before it, but only one succeeded. Resident Evil 7 beautifully struck a perfect balance of new and old, while Mass Effect Andromeda was a confused, clumsy mess with a serious case of amnesia. One remembered what it was while the other forgot, and if we compare the two games in question, we can see how Mass Effect Andromeda could have learned from Resident Evil 7.
I'm so glad Knight's virus works. Do you need anything? See you later, Laveria.
The Mass Effect trilogy was revolutionary. BioWare built a deep, expansive science fiction world that sucked players in and rewarded their loyalty with a personalized experience on a scale that no other series could offer. Those games were built on meaningful choices, space politics, and banging aliens, RPG-based gunplay, and they stayed true to those ideals from Mass Effect 1's opening title card to Mass Effect 3's closing credits. They were all genuinely Mass Effect, and that authenticity yielded a fairly consistent set of loyal fans, even despite the controversy surrounding Mass Effect 3's ending. Resident Evil, on the other hand, has had a rockier commitment to its core values. The first 4 numbered games are classics, both shaping the genre they helped create and continuing to breathe life into it almost a decade later. Resident Evil built itself upon its uneasy atmosphere, resource management, and tense gunplay, and those first 4 numbered entries embodied those concepts in one way or another. Unfortunately, the series began its descent into mediocrity after Resident Evil 4, and aside from a couple standouts, the franchise wholly abandoned the critical elements of its blueprint in a desperate effort to attract a larger audience. Despite strong sales, Resident Evil 5 and 6 represented a drastic tonal shift, with the latter garnering enough harsh criticism to force Capcom to reevaluate what a Resident Evil game was. This reassessment resulted in Resident Evil 7, the highly anticipated return to form that looked to usher in a modern yet recognizable era of Resident Evil, and it succeeded. Resident Evil 7, aside from the last hour, was a terrifying take on the formula established in the earlier titles. The Baker estate was an oppressive nightmare with enough moldy, cramped spaces to elicit an uneasy atmosphere. Ammo and healing items were always in short supply, and knowing how and when to use them brought back the heavy emphasis on resource management the newer installments had abandoned. And the terrifying intimacy of its newly founded first-person perspective mixed in with the cumbersome movement and aiming made combat a claustrophobic, stressful thrill ride, thus accurately translating and updating the tense gunplay from the earlier titles. Resident Evil 7 properly channeled the soul of its most revered predecessors while also feeling like a new, modernized horror game. And all of this brings us to Mass Effect Andromeda, the spiritual inverse of Resident Evil 7. Wonky facial animation, game-halting bugs, and boring, menial side missions were indeed huge problems, but tangential to the bigger issue. Andromeda seemed to have forgotten what made Mass Effect Mass Effect. Whereas the Mass Effect games from the last generation pinned multiple difficult decisions on the player that would have rippling effects and heavy, long-lasting consequences, Andromeda just doesn't have many meaningful choices. Decisions are few and very far between, and are trivial and weightless when they present themselves. While the whole Chosen One story in the original trilogy felt a little trite, it made you and your actions feel important. Here, it is the opposite. Choosing whether or not to blow up an enemy compound or sentient machine in Andromeda is petty compared to the heavy conundrums Shepard often faced. Ryder got off easy with only one truly Mass Effectian dilemma, and the whole game felt incredibly insignificant as a result. The space politics in Andromeda felt just as hollow as its choices. Mass Effect and its 2 sequels explored what it was like to have a bunch of unique alien races vying for equal power and respect amid the chaos that sort of diplomacy entails. The plethora of races naturally escalated the drama as the tangled interconnected web of moral gray areas grew more complicated and interesting with each new species. Andromeda only has two, yes only two, new races, which immediately sucks most of the intriguing space politics out of this so-called new galaxy. The Ket and Angaran conflict isn't interesting or complex enough to carry a piece of optional DLC, let alone an entire game. This lone, morally black and white rivalry turns Andromeda into a boring, empty rehash of the old galaxy, but without the multicultural history and alien political drama that made the first trilogy so exotic and memorable.
That's politics, Chief.
I hate politics.
Combat fared better, but it wasn't left unscathed. Hovering and dashing make firefights more kinetic, and outside of the numerous wide-open death zones and inconsistent auto cover, combat can sometimes feel like a worthy step forward. But this newfound mobility has come at the cost of its RPG roots. Having only 3 hotkeyed abilities at a time and not being able to command what powers your squad can use is awfully restrictive and less tactically involving. This simplified approach more heavily emphasizes the shooting and doesn't allow for the strategy that the power wheel and the other games allowed. Slowing down the pace of the combat in the original trilogy showed how committed BioWare was to their role-playing nature. Andromeda's RPG-based gunplay is less RPG and more gunplay, which has its advantages, but isn't completely in sync with the essence of the series. So how could Mass Effect Andromeda have learned from Resident Evil 7? Ignoring how these two games released only 2 months apart, BioWare should have emulated Capcom's approach to Resident Evil 7 by effectively analyzing the series' core pillars and presenting those ideas in recognizable but inspired ways. BioWare failed to do that with Andromeda and instead made a flawed game that becomes more problematic and disappointing when compared to its previous 3 iterations. Mass Effect is allegedly on hold for now, but if BioWare gets another crack at it, they better be able to more faithfully translate, update, and implement the franchise's central ideals. Because if they don't, they're destined to kill Mass Effect and be yet another victim of the collectorship that is EA. Thanks for watching.